All right, so we leave the ancient world behind, and Saint Augustine of Hippo, which is a city in North Africa, is going to be our first medieval philosopher. And I was also a history major in my undergrad, and there's lots of different dates people have for the Middle Ages. I personally prefer, if I had to pick a date, it would be, I think, 497 through 1453. But it's easier, and the reason I picked those two dates is because I believe the first date is when the last Roman emperor died, and in 1453 is the fall of Constantinople to the Turks. And so if you remember, Byzantium or Constantinople is the Eastern Roman Empire, which continues for another 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, which is amazing to think about, and also known as Byzantium. But St. Augustine is there in the West under Roman jurisdiction. And remember, at that time, St. Constantine the Great, because the Roman Empire had gotten so huge, he split it into two parts, an Eastern and an Eastern and a Western Roman Empire, where we have a Latin West and a Greek-speaking East. And I think it's really interesting because in the East, there's a saying, all the heresies started in the East and were resolved in the West. And at the time of Augustine, there is only one church. There is, and it's the Holy Catholic Church. And remember, Catholic means universal. When we are talking about the church at Rome, I will specify I'm talking about the Roman Catholic Church. But at this time, we just have one Catholic Church. It includes 5 major bishoprics. And basically, Christianity has followed the Roman system of administration. And we see the church mirrored culturally with the Roman Empire. So just how we have like this pyramid with the emperor on top and down to like the nobility, governors, rulers, all the way down into the provinces, the church is set up in the same type of Roman bureaucracy. In fact, a lot of the church garb, clothes, hats, mitres are all reflecting like Roman civil service. And it was something the Romans did very well. They governed and administrated well. And so the church simply adopted that sort of imperial form of hierarchy, where you get a pope all the way down to the laity or the common people. Anyways, there is only one church all the way up till 1054, where we have a schism, but we're about 500 years off from then. It's easier to just round up the dates to like 500 to 1500 could count as the Middle Ages. But the period between 500 to 1000, depending on who you're reading, if you're reading a Roman Catholic historian, this would be called the Golden Age or the Age of Faith. If you're talking to a secular humanist, this is called the Dark Ages, an age of fear and superstition, of no development. So perspective is an amazing thing, even when looking at history. Well, St. Augustine is, let me see if I got the dates for him here. 354 to 430 AD is the time we have. And so he's born into an empire where Christianity is legal. And actually, yeah, it's legal, but then it becomes the state religion in his lifetime. But another significant event also happens in his lifetime. In 410, Rome is sacked for almost the first time in 1,000 years by the Goths and the Visigoths and the Vandals. We still use the word vandal today to describe vandalism. I'll never forget, I was teaching a humanities class on art, and we were doing it chronologically, and I was showing all this beautiful classical Greek and Roman sculpture. But if you've seen classical Greek and Roman sculpture, many of them are missing limbs or noses or ears or their heads. And one of the people in my class, they were being kind of snotty, bad attitude. And they said, well, if the Greeks were such good artists, how come most of their statues are missing limbs? and it's like vivisectionist statue. And I thought the person was joking, but it turned out they were serious. And I said, they didn't sculpt them that way. They were vandalized by these Germanic tribes coming in and taking home souvenirs. And basically that's why we have all these, like Venus de Milo, one of the most famous statues, is just a torso. She has no arms or head, but you could tell by the form that this was an incredibly beautiful statue of feminine beauty. Anyways, this is the world St. Augustine is growing up in. And his mother was even a Christian and prayed for her boy every day. He was living in North Africa, and which was a Roman province, very different from the North Africa we see today. Back then, it was much more temperate. It was like the breadbasket for Rome. North Africa was planted with grains that would be harvested, shipped across the Mediterranean. And this is where Augustine grew up. He was a bright young man. He was studying in school. He was studying rhetoric. Remember the sophist? It's still like one of the leading professions. So he is studying the art of speaking and debate. And he's a teacher as well. And so he takes students unto himself. And Augustine lived a wild youth, wine, women, and song. He had a concubine. He had a child with this woman. He loved to party. He was a rabble rouser. But as he got older and was starting to mature a little and wanting to expand his academic career, he realized he would have better students and better pay if he moved to Italy proper. And so leaving North Africa, he set up a school or as a tutor in Milan, Italy. And there we had a famous bishop, Ambrose of Milan, who was one of the greatest preachers of his day. And Augustine fell under his influence and the magic of his words and the challenge of the gospel. And the story goes, one day Augustine was in his garden alone reading, and he heard this voice, and it was like a child from on the other side of the fence. And the voice said, "Take up and read." And he actually had a copy of the scriptures, and the passage he opened to, I think it was Paul's exhortation, and I can't remember the reference off the top of my head, but it was a passage that talked about, in times past you have lived in drunkenness and riotousness and wantonness, but the time is over for walking in the darkness, and it is now time to walk in the glorious light. And it was like a piercing from heaven into his soul, and he had like this conversion experience. And he put away his concubine. He became a celibate priest. He joined the church, and within a very short time was elevated to the position of bishop of the town of Hippo in North Africa, where he had returned. And part of his writings were he was using his profound intellect to address many of these competing heresies that were attacking the church, whether that was Neoplatonism or Gnosticism or Manichaeanism or Donatism or Arianism, whatever these happened to be, he would write apologetic disputations against these other competing worldviews. So that's a lot of what his work is about. But before we get to those, I want to start with his novel. This is novel literature in world literature, is his book called The Confessions, which is kind of like our first like tell-all autobiography, where he just bares his soul and says, this is who I was, this is what I have been saved from, and this is who I am now. And so he starts with his childhood and his upbringing, and it's just kind of like this tell-all book of who he was, the sinner he was, and how God saved him and gave him a new life. It's really quite insightful into what life would have been like in 4th century North Africa Roman cultural village and household, especially where you have a pagan father and a Christian mother. So he had quite the spectrum of upbringing and role models. Any questions or comments yet? Now, a lot of people praise the book Confessions. I was personally quite horrified by it, especially when he praises his disciplinarian mother. I mean, this guy was raised so strict and with a rod. But when he talks about his mother's childhood, when she was a little girl and how she was raised, a lot of corporal punishment, a lot of beatings, and all of that for like behavior modification to kind of try to drive the devil out of you or bad behavior out of you. But it's done out of fear, right? It's not done out of love or giving someone an understanding of why they should behave a certain way. It's like the threat of punishment or retribution if you step out of line. And I don't know, it's kind of hard for me to take listening it, and part of it is because I was raised in a very similar uber strict background where there was a lot of fear and this you knew what was going to happen if you stepped out of line, but not a lot of reasoning or understanding of why we do things a certain way. And I think a lot of that got passed into Christianity from Saint Augustine and his style of discipline and fear. And and anyways, we'll get back to that. The next book I want to highlight is City of God, City of Man. And this was kind of his apologetic against those who, after Rome had fallen, and imagine this, 313 for Christianity is legalized, 380 it's made the state religion, by 410 Rome is sacked for the first time in almost a millennia. And the Romans are not stupid people. They're doing the math. They're like, look what's happening. We've left the gods of war. We've left Jupiter. We've left these conquering deities who have made us prosper as a people. And now we're being overrun because we're worshiping this like pacifistic shepherd boy. And we need to return to the old gods if we want to reclaim the empire. And Augustine is like, oh, you people are so full of it. You pronounce Jesus with your lips, but in your hearts, you never stop being pagans. You have always been pagans, and God's judgment was brought upon you. And to add insult to injury, the Germanic tribes that sacked Rome, they had actually converted to Christianity, but to an Arian form of Christianity. So they were Christians, but they did not believe Jesus was co-equal, co-eternal with God. So it was like heretic pagan Christians that were sacking and overrunning Rome in the early part of the 5th century, 410. And so Augustine in City of God, City of Man is dealing with some of the false presuppositions of the Romans and showing that the city of God can never be overthrown or conquered, but it is eternal and immortal. And this is where we get an introduction of Platonic thought melded together with Christian theology, or you could say Neoplatonic, because in all his critique of the pagans and pagan philosophers, he believed Plato had come closest to the truth, and he was the least distorted of all the pagan Greeks. And in a sense, you could say, I know it's a figure of speech, but it's almost as if Augustine baptized Plato into the Christian faith and sanctified his philosophy and used it as a vehicle to teach Christian theology. And that became the standard all the way to the 13th century with the rise of Thomas Aquinas, where he did the same thing with Aristotle that Plato did with Augustine. And so it's so weird. We have Plato and Aristotle re-enter the philosophical fray, but through their proxies of Augustine and Aquinas in the medieval period. But those ancient Greek philosophies of idealism and realism continue, but now they've been integrated or hybridized with Christian theology moving throughout the medieval period. All right, I want to share my screen with you a little. And this is from, I think, last year or a couple years ago, where I was bringing up, we were talking about some of these Augustinian themes. There we are, Facebook. And this was the first article. Let me move this little box over here. I love that image. You see him being inspired by the Holy Spirit. The Flaming Heart, The Heart of Passion of St. Augustine. And here's a quick summary up here. After a riotous and pagan youth, his heart was pierced by the truth of the gospel, and he never looked back. Philosopher theologian who set the tone and pace of thought for the next 800 years, Plato meets Jesus in the heart and mind of Augustine. So that's kind of fun. The next is, he had a lot of interesting things to say about Genesis, and he actually believed that Genesis creation account was more allegorical. It wasn't supposed to be taken literal. And I found some really cool pictures that kind of indicated some of his views. So we saw the synthesis in City of God, City of Man. I'll get to that in a minute. According to Augustine, at the moment of creation, God planted in nature rationes seminals, or I guess that in the Latin it would be like seeds of reason. Okay, rationales seminal, like semen, or rational seeds. In due course of time, these seeds produce the forms of living things by natural process of unfolding. The rational seeds cannot be directly perceived by human senses, but each seed contains the potential for manifesting a specific gross form. According to the Catholic philosopher Frederick Copleston, the idea of the rational seeds did not come from Christian scripture or tradition. Augustine got the idea from the pagan philosopher Plotinus, that's the Neoplatonic guy, and ultimately it came from the Stoics. So he is tapping into the philosophy of the pagans, but then kind of sanctifying them or putting them into a Christian context. And so look at this picture. This is so interesting. You literally have, so when it says, let the earth bring forth living things, all those seminal rationales are already in the earth, in the water, in the air. And when God says bring forth, that's when it begins to produce. And it also shows how unique the creation of man is, because man was actually hand formed from the dust of the ground. Where all other creation, it was simply let the earth bring forth, let the seas bring forth, right? But with man, and then later with woman, they were specially created. Questions, comments on that?
Reminds me a little of C.S. Lewis's thing where I'm pretty sure in the creation story in Narnia, the creatures kind of came out of the ground as well.
Right, and the ground was so fecund that when, wasn't it just like a piece of the lamp got thrown into the creative soil, it sprouted and grew into a
Yeah,
full lamp, right?
yeah, something like
Or
that.
street light. And so, yeah, that kind of idea of this like super fertile ground, and all the seeds of the things of the kinds are preset. So when in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, he really did create everything. And then creation week, from, and this is Augustine's point of view, creation week is an unfolding or an unpacking of what happened in Genesis 1:1. Does that make sense? So Genesis 1:1 is like everything's done, and then it's an unfolding of what God had created through the creation week. And whether he saw it as 6 days or not, he's just seeing it as more of a poetic figure of speech than like a literal blow-by-blow account of creation. And I know many theistic creationists or theistic evolutionists will use him to try to say like, see, even way back in the medieval period, people weren't doing like a literal historical hermeneutic of. But remember, I can't remember, did I talk about Philo of Alexandria yet? I don't think I did. I should probably mention him quickly. So Philo of Alexandria was a Jewish philosopher from the 1st century. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing this for a moment. Alexandria was named after Alexander the Great. There were many Alexanders and Alexandrias in the world, but this particular one became such a cosmopolitan city. It makes me think of like a New York or a San Francisco of the ancient world, where you had all sorts of diverse people from all over the world, but it also had the world's greatest library of its day, the Library of Alexandria, which it still makes me so sad to think it was lost by fire, and the kind of books and manuscripts that would have been contained from the ancient world in that library. But Philo is a Hellenized Jew living in Egypt. And remember, those are Jews who have been affected by Greek culture, Greek philosophy. And he really admired the Greek philosophers, how they were able to synthesize philosophy with anthropomorphic Greek polytheism. And the way the Greeks were able to do that, most of them successfully, Socrates not so much so, it cost him his life, but other Greeks were able to avoid by simply saying the Greek pantheon was an allegory from which we could derive philosophical and moral truths. And he said, if we do the same thing with the Old Testament, we can reconcile Greek philosophy with Jewish theology. And he says there's all sorts of metaphor and simile taking place in the Bible. So for example, in the book of Genesis, where it says, the blood of Cain cried out from the ground. That's obviously a figure of speech. It's not like a puddle of Abel's blood. I'm sorry if I said Cain. Abel's blood formed a little mouth and is like, help me, Cain did it. It's not like that. It's a figure of speech, right? And then when God comes down, it says Cain is driven from the face of the Lord. Well, we know God is a spirit, so there's an anthropomorphism. It's a figure of speech. God does not have a face. And if God is omnipresent, we know you can't be driven out of his presence. And so it's another figure of speech, meaning Cain has been disfellowshipped. So if we have that kind of allegory, metaphor, figure of speech in the first chapters of Genesis, we shouldn't be afraid of it. And we can use allegory and metaphor to interpret the Bible. And later, a Christian theologian named Origen, also of Alexandria, embraced Philo's hermeneutic, even though he was a Jew, and applied it to the Old and New Testaments. And Origen's allegorical interpretation of the Bible, it's looking at the Bible almost like an onion or like an ochre because it has layers, right? Or like a parfait. And the idea is the outer reading is like the outer husk or shell of an onion. It's dirty, it's tough, you can't really digest it. And that's what the Bible or the scriptures are to the unillumined mind. They come to the Bible, but they can't understand it. They can't digest it because they can't penetrate the outer shell. But once it begins to be illuminated by the Holy Spirit, just imagine each layer of like an onion being peeled back. And you get into deeper and deeper and deeper teachings as the Holy Spirit illumines you. And that is how Origen was presenting the Bible. And both Philo and Origen are going to have a huge influence on Augustine and his hermeneutic and how he's interpreting the Bible. And so so there could be an actual literal historical event taking place, but as you peel back the layers, it takes you to the deeper spiritual meaning behind the historical events. For example, in the passage in Judges, I think it's Judges, no, it might be Joshua. It's Joshua. It's the day where Joshua commanded the sun to stand still so they would have more daylight to slay their enemies. And in that story, I believe there's 5 kings who form a coalition, and the Jews come in and they are commanded to kill every last one of them. It was one of those genocidal commands from God to the children of Israel. Well, during the heat of the battle, these 5 Canaanite kings saw it was going against them, so they went and hid in a cave. And then instead of pursuing them into the cave, they rolled stones over it, and then they continued the battle throughout the day. Well, I was at a school, a Christian college, and that was the text of the day. And the preacher read that passage, and then he closed his Bible, And then he slammed it down on the podium to make a big bang. And he said, he points at us and he says, "What kings have you hid in the cave of your heart?" And I was just like, whoa, what are you talking about? He goes, "Is it the king of pride? Is it the king of lust? Is it the king of fear? Is it the king of jealousy?" And so all of a sudden he turned what I had always read as like a historical account of the ancient battles of Israel into this like super applicable spiritual teaching, equating besetting sins or work of the flesh with kings. And he says, "Do you keep them in that cave and feed them just enough to keep them alive?" And it was a really great convicting sermon, but it had nothing to do with the text per se, unless you had that insight to see it, I guess is what you would say, right? And
That hiding thing of that text hiding the kings and the Canaanites hiding in the caves reminds me of what the kings and the people are gonna do in Revelation when God allows the sun to literally strike
right,
the surfaces of the sun, burn people, and
sure.
they're gonna hide and shake their fists at God, and you know what I'm referring to, right?
Yes,
I can't
but
remember the reference.
that's another good example, Christina. How do people interpret Revelation? You have some people that interpret it literally historically, but there's a lot of bizarre beasties and creatures and events, and some people are just like, I think maybe those lion-headed, winged, scorpion-tailed horses might be helicopters or something. That's probably not an actual chimera creature, but I don't know. I don't know if that's an actual creature.
It could actually happen. I mean, God could easily command the sun to burn somebody.
Sure. And that's another thing back to that passage. Did God really command the sun to stand still, or did he command the earth to stop rotating? I mean, what's happening there? Can you
The
imagine?
sun's always still. I don't think he would have had to command the sun to stop doing anything
The
except for like
sun's not
never.
still, my dear. The sun
Sorry.
is traveling through the universe at 500,000 miles an hour.
The sun
And
travels?
yes, it's it's orbiting around a black hole at the center of our Milky Way, as far as we know, right? No one's actually gone out in space to see that, but that is current scientific theory. And
They may have gone out there, but they would have been sucked into the black hole and couldn't come back.
right. You'd have to get outside of our galaxy to be able to see that, right? And no, we haven't done that yet. Anyways, I'm always tripping out on that story because can you imagine what would happen if the Earth stopped rotating, like with the tides and the ocean? We're moving at 1,000 miles an hour. That's how fast we're rotating. Unbelievable. And I'm not talking about how fast we're revolving around the sun. That's 60,000 miles an hour we're traveling.
Plus, how would it feel to us humans if the speed we're so used to the Earth moving suddenly just stopped? It's
Right,
like
it
when
was
a
like-
car is going 60 miles an hour and you slam on the brakes.
Exactly. Everything on the Earth would just go like, including the oceans, including the trees, including the mountains. I thought I was going to get dragged out of a church once because I suggested it was a figure of speech or something that, you know, I don't know what God did to prolong the daylight, but the idea of commanding the earth to stand still, it's already implying like a terracentric earth, right? Like the sun's revolving around us, not we're revolving around the sun. And so that's what like flat earthers and others would point to as text to like confirm their view of the cosmos. Anyways, whoo, like an onion, you're peeling back the layers. And part of the problem of the allegorical method is you are only limited by your own imagination what a text could mean. Now, could the Spirit give you insight? Absolutely. And I do believe that is possible. And at least for general practices, most conservative evangelicals shy away from allegorical interpretation, at least if you're talking about dispensationalist. If you're from a Reformed Covenant background, you're probably much more comfortable with allegorical interpretation. But at least in a literal historical hermeneutic, um, you have to be careful. If it's not in poetry or parable, then it's probably going to be taken literally. One more thing I want to mention is types. The difference between a type and an allegory or a metaphor or a simile is it's an actual historical event, but it's a foreshadowing of a future event to come. So, for example, the bronze serpent being lifted up in the wilderness by Moses to avert the plague of the poisoned serpents or those who had been bitten by them, it was an actual, literal, historical bronze serpent on a real staff, but it was a foreshadowing of Christ who would be lifted up for the salvation of the world. Okay, does that make sense? So that's what a type is, as opposed to simply an allegory or a metaphor or a simile. Woo! Back to St. Augustine. So now back to my image. And that allegorical interpretation was the standard in the Roman Catholic Church until the Reformation, and continues on for many Catholics to this day. They're much more comfortable with allegorical than the Reformers were. They were the ones who wanted to go to a literal historical. In this image here, we have a medieval manuscript image of St. Augustine, and he's holding up two cities. And in his book, The City of God, City of Man, he explains how just because the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God, as prophesied by the prophet Isaiah, Christians had confused the physical city of Rome, founded by Romulus and Remus, with the New Jerusalem when the empire converted to Christianity. And what Augustine is trying to tell them is, no, Rome is not the New Jerusalem. It was built by human hands, so it can be destroyed by human hands. But you can see how people in this 4th century would have been thinking maybe the prophecies of the Old Testament of the second coming of the millennial reign of Christ are coming to happen. And Rome is like the New Jerusalem, where God will set up his reign on earth. So when Rome gets sacked, that really messes with people's theology, because that should not have happened. And Augustine is saying, no, it's not the New Jerusalem. It's a city built by men, so it is destroyed by men. The city of God can never be destroyed because it is an eternal city and it is not built by human hands. And so you see that Platonic idea of the city of God being like the eternal forms, but the city of Rome or the city of Jerusalem here on earth, it's transitory, it's passing. They came into existence, they'll go out. But this city abides and remains. Is that helpful? Okay. Oh, there's a city of God, city of man. I love medieval art so much. The
How
desert.
could they think that a city built by man is the New Jerusalem when in Revelation it talks about the walls being made with like citrine and gold and diamond and materials that are super rare to
Because
find if they exist on Earth?
it's because of the allegorical method. You can just say, oh, that was a metaphor.
Okay.
Now, another really interesting thing is Augustine's view on sin and sex, because before he converted to Christianity, he was enthralled with Manichaeanism. And Mani was that 3rd century prophet coming out of Parthia, bringing Zoroastrian teachings. And in Zoroastrian teachings, your physical body, your physical sensations and pleasures, your flesh is aiding the god of darkness. So those who indulge in those things are serving that god, and those who serve the spirit and these higher things are serving the god of light. And even though he wrote an entire book against the Manichaeans, I think it stuck with him. I think he wasn't able to get rid of those views about his physical body being sinful and evil and his soul and spirit being good. And so he drug a lot of this view of like sex and sensual pleasures being evil. In fact, before the time of St. Augustine, women had held positions in the churches. Even in the book of Acts, we have prophetesses, we have deaconesses. I don't know that we have any bishopesses or female bishops, but we certainly have deaconesses and prophetesses, and women enjoyed a lot of privilege and prestige and honor in the church. But with St. Augustine, he had a very different view of women. And it was not a high view. Well, it's a paradoxical view that happens in the Middle Ages. On the one hand, woman is to be feared and put away and kept away from men because it is her that brought man out of the garden. It was her temptation of man that corrupted man and led to the fall. And so we want to avoid women. But on the other hand, so that's Eve, the temptress. On the other hand, we have Mary, the Theotokos, or Theotokos, the God bearer. It's all humankind is now redeemed through the Savior being born of woman. So the fall comes from woman and redemption comes from woman, or at least being conduits of the fall and the salvation. And this is where we get the whore saint dichotomy of females in the medieval mind, where you're either like a mother or a saint, or you're a prostitute and a whore. And which is ridiculous, right? Because a mother obviously is engaged in carnal sexual activities to produce children. And so how do you reconcile human sexuality with women? And for Augustine, he just didn't want to deal with it. He was just like celibacy, and if you want to be a priest or a servant of the church, you need to live a chaste life. And he really brought a lot of pressure on other bishops or priests who were married. Priests were still allowed to marry at this time in the Catholic Church. But after Augustine, he basically said, how can you serve God and live in such a carnal lifestyle? And he's talking about marriage at the same time. To him, it was inconceivable.
So I have a question. So you were mentioning how before St. Augustine that women had, these different roles in the churches. So how did his views on women change that?
Because he portrayed women as dangerous, as being the instruments of the devil to tempt and entice men. And it ties into his belief of what the forbidden fruit was in the garden. And what was the forbidden fruit?
Oh my gosh.
Tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah, but that's obviously a metaphor, right, Christina?
No.
Well, for Augustine it was, and guess what it was a metaphor for?
You got crazy.
Sin.
Nope.
Women.
Women, especially the sexual appetites or the carnal knowledge gained.
So I'm guessing he didn't believe in women's rights.
No. Women were dangerous and they needed to be sequestered. Now, but they were also a necessary evil because that is the means by which God chose to propagate the race. But you had to be very careful lest the woman drag you down from your holy life. And that's why St. Augustine, after his conversion, put away his concubine and lived a celibate life the rest of his days.
Wait,
So in this view, the forbidden fruit is actually carnal knowledge. It's when Eve offered Adam her sexuality, that was the forbidden fruit. Because before that, and let me pull up my next article, I think I have one more. And this just blew me away. We actually might have to go to, it's not Mattress Liquidators. Oh, it was up here. I didn't click on the link. So in this guy's article, I was blown away. So he doesn't come right out and say forbidden fruit equals female sexuality, but he kind of massages around the bush a little bit. And in this case, he believed that before the fall, Adam and Eve, they still would have sexual relationships, but it had nothing to do with the passions or the lust. And I'm going to speak a little graphically. I'm not trying to be crude. I just think it's important to understand this. So if a man and woman wanted to have children before the fall, now remember, in a Gnostic view, they were spirit beings, children of light. So if they were having babies, it would be spirit babies, not little physical flesh babies, but we would be producing spiritual children. Well, Augustine didn't go that far. He did believe Adam and Eve had physical material bodies. They weren't just spirit beings, but he did believe that that carnal knowledge was about human sexuality. But before the fall, when man was in his right mind, his nous was over his logos, his reason, and his cardia, his passion. We had the nous, like a hold of the reins, keeping everything in check. And so if a man wanted to have intercourse with his wife, he could do it without animalistic lust or passion. He could simply will himself to be aroused and to ejaculate, and without penetration of the female, simply by lying close to her, his seed could pass into her and she could be impregnated without copulation. And so he saw like the penetrative process as being like a violent violation and animal lust being perpetuated by the male upon the female, but being encouraged and incited by the female's own lust. And so he had a lustless, passionless procreation before the fall. And it's easy as 21st century people to dismiss this as medieval prudishness and tomfoolery. But if you start to think about his views on lust and sex and marriage and human sexuality and where it is today, how broken and fallen it is from how God designed it in the beginning, I think it's worth at least considering what he has to say, even though I definitely am picking up Gnostic, Neoplatonic, and Manichaean accretions, or like barnacles attached to what I personally believe is the biblical teaching.
So I'm curious because I have friends that have different odd views about that sort of thing as well. What did he specifically do with the Song of Solomon?
It's obviously a metaphorical epic poem about Christ and the church.
It has absolutely nothing to do with Solomon and his actual wife.
No, please.
My gosh. Interesting.
In fact, it was the favorite book of the medieval monastics.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. They didn't have anything else to go off.
But it was Christ's love for us. It was spiritual. It was holy. It was pure. It wasn't carnal lust. It was divine love. His banner over me is love.
Probably both, but wow, that's very interesting.
Isn't that great?
That's fascinating.
But you see this kind of impact. He was like the leading theologian in the West. So when he brought his views and his prejudice and his misogyny into the church, it continues until this day. I have a love-hate relationship with Augustine. I love his wedding of Neoplatonism and Platonic thought with Christian theology. I'm just geeked out over that. But his view of women, of human sexuality, of pleasure, it's just like, no, why? Don't bring that poison into the church. And unfortunately, it became quite pronounced. And women lost a lot of status, a lot of participation, a lot of avenues of human spirituality and sexuality because of this old Gnostic and pagan type thinking that came. It's this dualistic thinking. Spirit is good, flesh is evil. And I do not believe that's a biblical teaching, but I think Augustine kind of helped bring some of that thinking into Christendom. Did someone want to say something? Okay. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you've never read Confessions or City of God, City of Man, super interesting. It's quite clear to see how easy, and I already gave you examples, so I won't do it again, but how easy it is to combine these Platonic forms, concepts, and physical material things with this idea of the reality of God in the Holy of Holies, the heavenlies, our ability to think about it, and then the physical mirroring of that or shadowlands of that here on earth. And you see that even in like C.S. Lewis's Shadowlands book, right? This idea of this is a world of shadows. It's transitory, it's passing. But that which is eternal is that which cannot be seen. And so it's easy to do this Platonic Christian theology hybrid. And it like I said, it will last all the way up until the 13th century and Thomas Aquinas. But before we get there, we have a couple more medieval philosophers. And I think next week we'll pick up with John Scotus Eriogena.